Alrighty, folks, we are recording. We are waiting a few minutes for people to arrive. And for those of you that are already here, thank you. I appreciate you coming in on time. I'm just going to give it one more minute for everyone to come in. This is great, folks, because this is the first webinar where I'm actually showing techniques. I'm going to have my lovely wife Elena on the table and want to demonstrate and show some forearm techniques, specifically the ones that we use in the Morales method. You've probably seen tons of forearm techniques in all different modalities, and that's great. And you've probably learned how to work all sorts of specific muscle tissue, but I want to show you just a little bit of how we do it in the Morales method, specifically in the core integration program. The core integration therapist program is a program geared to give you great training in structural integration. There's lots of information on the website, and you can go in and check it out. But I wanted to show you how exactly we look at the forearm with regards to core integration. Alrighty. So also, if you have any questions, you can ask. You can type in a message in the chat room, and I'll be glad to respond. If you think of a question later on, then you can get to me either through the Morales Method Facebook page, through Twitter, or email Marty at Marty Morales. But if you remember the question right now, now is the best time to get a hold of me. Alrighty. So without further ado, let's do it. Let's have Elena, if we can get Elena on the table. Thank you for joining. So we're going to get her on the table here. And before we start, I've got Mr. Otto's arm, and wanted to show you just a little bit of some landmarks. When I work the arm and I'm working the arm, I think about radius. I think about ulna. Yes, there are all sorts of other muscles involved, but I think about how is the radius relating to the humerus, how is the ulna relating to the humerus, and how are the radius and the ulna relating to themselves. I do teach classes on frozen shoulder and on carpal tunnel, and we talk about it that way. But with regards to core integration, I think about how are these bones moving along certain planes. How are they moving along the sagittal plane? How are they moving along the coronal plane? At least the whole arm. How's the whole arm moving along the coronal plane? And then how eventually, how are they moving along rotation? So how is the radius rotating around the ulna? Just a little tidbit I wanted to share with you is with core integration, we look at people and we look at their bodies and movement in different planes. The sagittal plane, coronal plane, transverse plane, and eventually along rotation. And this is tied to the stages of motor development in babies. We move in that order. We eventually start to move in that order. We employ movement in the sagittal plane, employ movement in the coronal plane, eventually employ movement along transverse plane and along different hubs of our body. And then the end product is rotation as we start to move in a more finely tuned manner. So we think of rotation as a product of these other movements from the other planes. So that being said, when I check an arm, when I check a forearm, I want to check for movement. How is it moving along these planes? And I'll put this one away. And I want to check for movement along this plane here for Elena's right forearm. So in this case here, what I want to do is I want to see, hey, how is there movement along the forearm here? And how is there movement in the tissue from this direction to this direction, either on this side of her forearm or on this side of her forearm. Sorry for the sirens. Welcome to San Francisco. If you're not in San Francisco, you've just got a little version of what it's like to live in a busy street. So here I have my fingers on this tissue, and I'm feeling for movement along this plane from here to here. And I want to feel, hey, how does it move? Does it move easily, or is there directional resistance? If you've been watching my other webinars, then you'll know what I am talking about when I mean directional resistance. What is the direction in which the tissue is resisting? And when I sink in and I feel this tissue here, I feel that it likes to go this way much easier than it likes to go this way. And so I start to feel for directional resistance in this direction, and that's the way I would work. So it could be as easily as sinking in my fingers, sinking into the level of depth where I feel that end range. Art Riggs, in his deep tissue myofascial release books and workshops, he talks about sinking into end range. Well, we're doing that too. We're sinking into end range, and once I feel that, then I can take the tissue in the direction of resistance. You let me know, how's the pressure, okay?
Yeah, it's pretty good.
It's pretty good. So, you know, one thing that's interesting is that we are able to do deep tissue work without having to employ a lot of force, a lot of muscle exertion on our part. So, and that's because we are doing two things. We're sinking into end range, and then we're moving in the direction of resistance, at least in this case. So here I am feeling for movement, directional resistance in this direction. So we're going from anterior to posterior. And I can do this all up and down the forearm. I can go in here on this in this place of the forearm. I can go all the way over here. Here we go into less muscle tissue, but that's okay. We're going, then we have the opportunity to go into more deeper tissue and affect interosseous membrane, for example. We'll get into interosseous membrane in a bit, but notice here I'm going again in that direction. I can also go in this direction, and I can feel for directional resistance going inferior to superior for the forearm. And I can feel again for end range, sinking into end range, and then take the tissue in the direction that it likes to go or doesn't like to go. In this direction, it does. In this situation, in this case, it doesn't like to go this way. So I want to take it in this direction. So again, it's not so much, and this is something that I see very often in workshops, where someone will start to palpate their partner and say, "Oh, I can't tell what direction it's going or not going in." Well, that's because you haven't sunken in to end range. If I'm just doing this, of course, I'm way off into the surface. I can't feel what's happening. So I have to sink in just a bit. Here's end range. And now I feel for directional resistance. And voila, I feel for directional. I feel the tissue being resistant in that direction. And then guess what? That's the direction we're going to go in. This is a very, very standard lengthening, as we call it. You know, if it is actually what we're doing, lengthening the tissue, but it's a standard lengthening technique where I'm going from this direction from this point to this point, or at least in that direction, to add fluidity, to add length, to add release, or to have the tissue release, however you want to think of it. And I can do this up and down. I don't have to do this in a session. I don't have to do this along the whole forearm, because it may not be the whole forearm that needs the work. So I could palpate up and down the whole forearm and then feel for that area that's going to give me the most bang for my buck, and sink in and then take the tissue in the direction that it's resistant. Since I'm working from inferior to superior or vice versa, that's what I'm going to work with. If I was working with a really muscular forearm, fingers may not be enough, and I may need to do some other technique. So if you wanted to do a deeper technique or a more deep tissue technique, then I would suggest using forearm, your own forearm, to work their forearm. In this case, I'm going to work, use this part of my forearm, this part of my ulna and elbow, and I can find the area that I felt that directional resistance in, and then take it in the direction of resistance. And here I'm going again in that direction. How's the pressure?
It's good.
It's good. So I sink into end range, and then I'm taking the tissue in the direction of resistance. Notice my other hand was a little sneaky here. I actually extended her wrist, and if this were a session, I could also then add some flexion to the wrist or decrease that extension, and that would lengthen the tissue underneath my forearm. So I'm doing two things at once here to be even more effective with the technique. So again, I may be doing this with this hand at the same time that I'm working here with my right forearm on her right forearm. If we wanted to work specific areas or territories, my suggestion is that you don't complicate things in the very beginning, that you stick to one plane. You might be thinking, well, what about rotation, Marty? What about taking it in rotation at the same time that you're going in this direction? That's great. But remember what we said, rotation is actually a product of the other planes. So you could actually work sagittal plane, coronal plane, transverse plane, and in essence, affect rotation. So think more about what are you doing right now, and try to filter out all that other information that you're getting. And then later on, you can look at that other information to see if that actually got affected by the work you did. I think a lot of times what we do as body workers is that we take in too much information. And when we're asked to body read in a core integration class, then sometimes I'll hear from an instructor, sometimes I hear from a student, I can't see it. I can't see what you see. And it's not really that you can't see what I see. It's actually that you're seeing too much, and that you have to filter out all that information to be able to see what we're talking about, to see what I'm talking about. So that happens sometimes. But getting to rotation, we can absolutely get into rotation, and I can start to pronate or supinate her forearm, Elena's forearm, as I'm working. To show you with fingers, I can then feel, let's say I want to feel for directional resistance, and I feel for directional resistance in this part of her forearm. I feel that it's going in this direction. Again, similar to what we were doing before. I feel that it's going in this direction. And one way to help me to lengthen this tissue is to pronate at the same time that my left hand is taking the tissue in this direction. So as my left hand is taking the tissue in this direction, I can pronate her arm, effectively lengthening that forearm tissue. Again, if you have any questions, if I'm going too fast, let me know. If you have any questions, feel free to type them in. Here I found something really nice, some juicy information, and I want to hang out with this information here. What I mean is I found some tight tissue that I could hang out with. Keep in mind that the directional resistance here could be different than the directional resistance here. So I could be working in this direction on this part of the forearm, and I can then, if I feel so, I could be working in this direction on this part of the forearm. So keep that in mind, folks. If I wanted to work in this direction and this were a session, I may use fingers as such and then take her into supination. And that would help me lengthen the tissue that's resistant in this direction. I could work in supination this way. So pronation, if I work from anterior to posterior, supination if I wanted to work posterior to anterior. And I can take this technique all the way down to by the carpals. I've been hanging out with this part of the forearm most of the time, but I want to show this area here for a little bit. I just had a question, are knuckles too sharp for the forearm? No, knuckles are totally fine for the forearm as long as you're sinking in and you're not pushing past end range. So you could, I'm going to step out of the frame for a little bit, but you could use knuckles this way. And if you were going to use knuckles this way, then you could straighten out your arm as such. And what I did is I pronated my hand. As you can tell in the camera, this is a nice angle. You can tell that my palm is facing away. And what that does is that aligns all the knuckles here. Aligns all the knuckles, the joints, the knuckle joints, the carpal bones, the elbow, so that I can sink into that tissue. And I don't have to employ a whole lot of pressure to be able to do that. So great question. Going back to here, we can work the inside part of the forearm just like we work this outside lateral part. And again, feeling for directional resistance. This area here, I'm going to show the camera. This area here is a really important place when dealing with tendinitis. Tennis elbow, golfer's elbow. I want to make sure with either one of those situations, I want to make sure that I'm going to this area. The reason is the biceps brachii attaching up in here, and yes, the bicep brachii tendon attaches to the radius, but there's also aponeurosis tissue that attaches to the ulna right in here, which is called bicipital aponeurosis. And that's tissue that we want to address when we work the forearm. So here I am, and I've got fingers almost like a fan, but they're closer together. And again, I feel for directional resistance. Very easy when I go this direction, but when I go this direction towards Elena, then I run into some directional resistance and I can work it. So I brought up her arm just a bit, flexed her elbow so that I can get a little bit into that tissue. That flexes her elbow, that gives me some slack, and I can sink into this tissue a little bit more. And then I can take the tissue in the direction of resistance. In this case, I'm sinking in this way and towards her. So up and in a bit. This could just be the technique, but I could also employ, guess what? Some movement. I can employ some supination in order to add further length to her forearm. If they're using, not just golfers or tennis players, but if people are using their forearms a lot, construction workers that are constantly using their hands, electricians that are constantly using their hands, that constant grasping and gripping is using a lot of this muscle tissue. So we can help them relieve strain in that tissue by working as such. So here I am, I can do this movement here. It ended up being a little bit of a rotational movement, but if I wanted to work purely in that direction, I could do so as well. I could also move up closer to the carpals. Now I want you to just be aware that when we're working this high up and we're working around carpals, we want to make sure that we leave nice and easy space for the median nerve. The median nerve, if your clients are dealing with strain or some sort of situation similar to carpal tunnel syndrome, then we want to make sure we're not putting any pressure in that median nerve because they could already be inflamed and we don't want to exacerbate their symptoms. So if we go up here, we want to make sure we give plenty of space. We can work medial or lateral to that median nerve, okay? And the same rule applies that we did when we had her arm like this and we had her wrist in extension. We could have the wrist in flexion, sink into the tissue, and then bring the wrist, the hand into extension in order to lengthen the tissue that we're working on. So I'm going this way with my left hand, and I'm going in the direction of resistance with my other hand. Just like so. Another thing is that I don't see too often is people actually getting close to the elbow joint. And I want you to be comfortable and, start doing it to gain confidence to be able to work in this area. Now, mind you, there are nerves. There's ulnar nerve, median nerve, radial nerve, all sorts of things passing through this hub. So if you're not sure exactly where you're at, open up your Netter's book or open up your anatomy app and find the location of the ulnar, the median, and the radial nerve so that you're not on it. But you can get into this area, and sometimes what I'll do is I'll flex the elbow. You can't see too much where my hand is, so I'll change hands, but flex in here, flex the elbow, and sink into the tissue. We're going to be in tendon territory here, and sink into this tissue and do, again, work in the direction of resistance. If you think that the person is dealing with some sort of tendonitis, or if you know that the person is dealing with some sort of tendonitis, then what you might want to do is work with cross fiber. So once I'm in here, I may work in the direction of cross fiber. So again, I'm in here, and I'm moving away from her, and then towards Elena, and then away towards the laptop, towards the camera laptop. So I'm going this direction in this direction. So that's a very basic cross fiber technique. Now, the other technique I want to show you is very much something we do in our core integration work, and that's working with the interosseous membrane. The interosseous membrane is a very important area for us. It's a very core tissue. We may not be able to get right on it, but we can affect it. We can work it. So what we're going to do is imagine that interosseous membrane between radius and ulna. So we have a very thick membrane deep in the forearm. And one of the ways we're going to work it is by taking the ulna and the radius through some ranges of motion. And what that's going to do is, in effect, stretch and move that interosseous membrane in different directions, and then we can feel the directional resistance of the interosseous membrane. So here we go. What we usually do is hold the ulna and hold the radius. And I'm going to show you here on Mr. Otto's arm. We're going to hold them like this, and then I'm going to do slow, gentle movement, moving my hands this way to get movement happening in that interosseous membrane. So again, I may hold it, and then my left hand is going superior while my right hand is going inferior, and then I switch. My right hand goes superior as my left hand goes inferior. So going in these directions. As I do that, I could feel for some directional resistance. Which way is it easier for the bones to move? Which way is it not as easy? And what I need to do is I really need to hold and focus and pay attention to what the bones are doing, because that'll give me the best indication of what the interosseous membrane is doing. So here, when I'm feeling Elena's right forearm, I feel that her ulna really likes to go towards her head, and her radius really likes to go towards her feet. It's very easy for the bones to do that. And then when I try to go in the opposite direction, I feel, even before I'm jamming into any joints, or before I even start to reach the end point of any joint, I start to feel restriction. So I then know that there is restriction in possible restriction in that IOM, the interosseous membrane, in that direction and in this direction down here. So I could work the interosseous membrane that way. One way would be to just focus on the radius and take the tissue, take that radius towards her humerus, just like so. Or I can focus on the ulna and take the tissue, that ulna, towards her hand, towards her carpals. Another thing, I don't usually show thumbs, but another way would be to employ thumbs, and I can use my thumbs and go in this direction. So this direction with my right thumb and this direction with my left thumb. And I can find the area where I want to affect the interosseous membrane, and slowly, here I'll turn her arm so you can see this, and slowly take the tissue in that direction, and take the tissue in both directions. Doing okay?
Feels good.
Feels good?
Yeah.
The trick here is you have to sink into end range, and you have to really be present. This is not something that you can just do, in a 1 hour massage and think about what you're having for lunch. You really have to focus. You really have to be here, and feel what might be happening under your thumbs. So I'm not sinking in any deeper than I need to. I've reached end range, and I'm taking the tissue in both directions. And like right there for a bit, I really felt that I was in that deep part of interosseous membrane. This is what my sessions look like when I'm working. I may be working one area for a good amount of time before I move off to another area. With core integration, we deal with particular territories in different sessions. So it's possible that we could be hanging out with this forearm for a good 10-15 minutes. Here I go. Even though there's muscle tissue, I was here in this area, but even though there's muscle tissue, I can still sink in and do the work. Now, if you're thinking, Marty, my thumbs are shot, I can't do this, there's another way you can do it. Let's say, for example, I needed to go this way, and I wanted this ulnar territory tissue to go in this direction. Then I could put a elbow right up in here and ask my client to imagine that they are extending their ulna towards their feet. So they are in effect helping me do this work. Vice versa, I could also be working down here by ulna, and I can ask my client to bring their wrist, to bring their ulna in this direction. So lengthening that tissue as my left hand would be working in this direction. So in that case, we're employing movement. We're doing movement education. We're getting them to really go deep and feel the movement of their interosseous membrane. So just wanted to share a few techniques with working the forearm. Thanks for watching. Thank you all for coming and taking the time to watch this webinar. It will be available later in the recording. If you have any other questions, feel free to either email me later or post your question on the Morales Method Facebook. Again, thanks for watching, and I hope to see you in future webinars.